go. Share the screen here for what is a very interesting chapter, to say the least. So today, we have last week we had the generations of Esau, then we had the dreams of Joseph, his coat, then the brother's terrible response. Today, we shift to Tamar, or Tamar. So I'm going to quote Brueggemann on this one. This particular chapter stands alone without connections to its context. It is isolated in every way and is most enigmatic. It is not evident that it provides any significant theological resource. It is difficult to know in what context it might be of value for theological exposition. All right, so that's what he thinks. We'll jump in with that prelude. This is sort of the way that Brueggemann cracks me up. He says this whole thing, that's his introduction to this chapter, right? To chapter 38. And but then he spends 4.5 pages talking about the particulars of the story. He's like,
do we get this story in the cycle of readings?
I don't think we do.
I don't think we do.
Not certainly. If we do, we only get a very specific part of it and not much. It's too scandalous otherwise to have as a Sunday morning reading, I'm pretty sure. All right, so here we go. Now it was about that time, chapter 38, that Yehuda went down away from his brothers and turned aside to an Adullamite man. His name was Hira. There Yehuda saw the daughter of a Canaanite man. Her name was Shua, as he took her as his wife and came into her. And she became pregnant and bore a son, and he called his name She became pregnant again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Once again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Now he was in Saziv, when she bore him. Yehuda took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Yehuda's firstborn, did ill in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord caused him to die. Yehuda said to Onan, come into your brother's wife, do a brother-in-law's duty by her, to preserve seed for your brother. But Onan knew that the seed would not be his, so it was. Whenever he came into his brother's wife, he let it go to ruin on the ground, so as to not provide seed for his brother. What he did was ill in the eyes of the Lord, and he caused him to die as well. Now Yehuda said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, sit as a widow in your father's house until Shelah, my son, has grown up. For he said to himself, otherwise he will die as well like his brothers. So Tamar went and stayed in her father's house. All right, so we're looking at a tradition that's only recorded about 2 or 3 places, 2 or 3 different times in the Bible, called Levirate marriage. It does not come from Leviticus, but from the term in Latin, levir, husband's brother, right? So Levirate marriage then comes from levir, a husband's brother or brother-in-law, right? So we'd say it in English. Or a husband's brother, but yeah, which would be a brother-in-law. How widespread or often it was used is unknown, and every single time it gets brought up, it is one that they say the same thing, which is, we don't know if this was really a common thing or they just recorded it here as an occasional thing. What we do know is that it's clearly a dominating part of this narrative, and we have to understand what Levirate marriage is, so that we can talk about what it is. I mean, how it works. So here's the exact verse, Deuteronomy 25:5. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. The firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. In other words, whoever has, like if a brother dies, the younger brother has to marry his wife, and then that first son will be as though from the first brother and will take on that part of the house, right? Which means awake in Hebrew, takes Tamar, which means date, like the fruit from a date tree, to be his wife. Now, we don't know what he did to displease God. We just know that he ends up getting killed by God or dies by God's hand, or just he dies and they blame it on God. Whichever way, pretty immaterial because that's not really the main part of the story, right? Or Onan has to take Tamar to build up Er's name so that whatever child is born first, Tamar and Onan would be the heir to Er's inheritance. Which means likely that means Onan's own child, his own children from his other wife, whoever that might be, would be disinherited so that this other child from Tamar would take it. The weird structure, right? But that's the structure that we're given. Which incidentally, almost everyone agrees that Deuteronomy was written several hundred years, if not 800 years after Genesis and some of these other texts, depending on which person you count. So all of this is lots of levels of funky. Onan chooses to spill his seed on the ground to prevent any pregnancy, to thwart. He has to do this, so he does it. He follows the orders, but he doesn't want to have a child with Tamar, and so it creates this really terrible situation. As a result of this story, the name Onan or Onanism has come to mean masturbation in many modern languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Japanese, Swedish, English, German, just to name a few. That's what happens when you break the rules, I guess. Because of this story, Onan or Onanism is masturbation. All right, so then God strikes him down for thwarting the plan of life and errs and breaking the rules. Maybe. When I say maybe, it's the same as the first. In this case, it's specifically, we're given a reason why God chooses to smite him. But of course, it's also sort of weird all the way around. Really, all we can do is sort of live into this part of the story. Tamar is sent home because Judah is rightly concerned that this woman seems to be killing his sons, or their connection to her is bad luck. Either way, he ends up with dead sons, and he'd like his last one to live. So Shelah, which means petition, is hidden away to save him from Tamar and her bad luck. We'll pause there first. Questions, thoughts, comments on this rather crazy levirate marriage process? Or
Yet
Tamar?
another verse that wouldn't make a good children's book.
No, this is not a children's story, to be sure. All right, so now comes the fun part. I'm going to go a sidetrack, but it's worth it. Does anyone know where levirate marriage impacts Anglican and Episcopal identity? It's why we have an Episcopal church. So this is Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, and then younger brother, Henry VIII. That's exactly where levirate marriage came to play. So just going to give you a quick history. Henry VII, who was the first Tudor monarch after the Long War of the Roses, he needed legitimacy as a king, so he negotiated to marry his eldest son, Arthur, to Isabella and Ferdinand's youngest daughter, Catherine of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon was the youngest daughter to Spain's monarchs and was connected to the English Lancaster kings on her mother's side. So it gave Henry VII what he craved, a connection to Isabella and Ferdinand were the most powerful monarchs of the era. So it was connected then to Spain, and through Isabella was connected to the English Lancaster kings. So it strengthened through that marriage his claim to the English throne, right? Pretty good plan for a marriage. Henry VII needed the political connections, he needed the propaganda victory, and even more, he needed the cash infusion from a royal and large dowry, right? I think it was 100,000 pieces of gold that was given for this marriage, right? So to connect the thrones of England and Spain. Catherine of Aragon was 3 years old when she was betrothed to Arthur, Henry VII's eldest son, right?
Wow.
When Arthur turned 16, he wed Catherine, who was 17 in England, in the first grand royal wedding. Before this, all royal weddings were sort of just the Archbishop of Canterbury. They were hidden away. This was the first public open for everyone to see because, again, Henry VII wanted this as a propaganda victory. Look, England is part of the big boys now. The Tudor name will long reign in England. It was important to have it, right? It was supposed to be this huge connection to Europe, securing the Tudor line for generations to come, promise for the future, all those kinds of things, right? The only problem, Arthur died 5 months after the wedding. And Henry VII had spent the entire dowry and was stuck with the daughter of Spain's monarch. So, invoking levirate marriage, Henry VII required his son Henry VIII to marry his brother's wife. So while we think all this stuff is once upon a time long, long ago, Henry VIII got married to Catherine of Aragon because of levirate or marriage, right? So this is all bizarre, but it's all connected, right, in weird ways. And then Henry VIII grew frustrated with the situation, but here's the key that they never really explained. He was married to Catherine for 24 years. 24 years. Mary was the only child that lived out of their marriage, and he wanted a male heir. He wanted his own queen and sought a divorce because he declared levirate marriage was immoral and wrong, and that it didn't make any sense, and he should be able to get out of it, right? He should have the wedding annulled, the marriage annulled. The Pope would not allow it, as we know. Why? Because of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this part we don't tend to teach in the church either, because it's not about the church, it's about politics in 1519. Charles V did not want his aunt divorced and humiliated by the Henry VIII. He wanted the connection to England and to another royal family that Mary could provide, right? Mary Queen would be if she was consecrated as queen. He also, here's the key part, Henry V had a large army that controlled Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, that whole region of the world as Holy Roman Emperor. And by the way, he also had a large portion of northern and southern Italy. In other words, if you look at the map here, this is all that Charles V controlled. That little black dot in the middle is Rome. In other words, there's a giant army to his north and a giant army to his south for the Pope. And when Henry VIII said, I want a divorce from Catherine, and then Charles said no, the Pope looked around and said, yeah, I'm going to go with no on this one so I don't get invaded tomorrow. It was a really easy equation for him, right? Charles V prevented the divorce. The Pope needed Charles to fight Luther and the reformers in Germany, so Henry VIII broke with Rome. So in other words, because of levirate marriage, we have an Episcopal Church. Weird, huh? But that's what happened. Again, this is a total side comment, but it is fascinating. Any questions about, I don't know, levirate marriage or Henry VIII or Charles V or 1519 political political authority?
You know, I know of in the farming community where I grew up, there was a man who did that, but I think he loved the woman. No one forced him to marry his brother's wife, but she was left as a young widow with a small child, and he did marry her, and they were married for 50-something years and happy. And Selden had relatives who did, two relatives who did that, married
the husband and wife, in each case, the wife died and the husband would marry the next sister in line.
It was a sister instead.
It was a sister.
Okay.
We had 2 cases of that in my dad's family.
Some of that, though, I think was a long time ago and came from the time when the people didn't go far from their communities, you know,
Right.
and to get a spouse. They didn't, like we go away to school and we do all kinds of things where we meet other people. But at that time, in those farming communities, I don't think
In our case, everybody had been there since the 1790s.
so I think they just
they didn't
didn't,
know anybody else.
yeah, they didn't
Yeah.
leave their community. So they wound up, you know, choosing from the people there.
And I think that's certainly more akin to probably the story of Tamara and the brothers and everything else as well. I mean, these are tiny towns and villages with not a lot of people in them, not a lot of options too, right? I mean, it's the people you know, and there's not a lot of choice.
Right. It's just whoever's part of that community.
And not all the families loved each other either.
No,
Uh-oh.
Well,
This is not a Valentine story, is it?
No, it doesn't sound like it.
I hadn't thought of that, but no.
Wasn't happy.
No. You've heard that story.
No,
All right, well, so we'll continue then. After many days passed, now Shua's daughter, Yehuda's wife, died. And when Yehuda had been comforted, he went up to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, to Timnah. Tamar was told, saying, "Here, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." She removed her widow's garments from her, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself. And she sat down by the entrance to Enaim, 2 wells, which is on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, yet she had not been given to him as a wife. When Yehuda saw her, he took her for a whore, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Come now, pray let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me for coming into me?" And he said, "I myself shall send out a goat kid from the flock." She said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What is the pledge that I am to give you?" And she said, "Your seal, your cord, and your staff that is in your hand." He gave them to her, and then he came into her, and she became pregnant by him. And she arose and went away. Then she put off her veil from her and clothed herself in her widow's garments. Now, when Yehuda sent the goat kid by the hand of his friend, the Adulamite, to fetch the pledge from the woman's hand, he could not find her. He asked the people of her place, saying, "Where is that holy prostitute or temple prostitute?" Depending on which way you translate it. "The one in 2 wells by the road." They said, "There has been no holy prostitute here." So he returned to Yehuda and said to him, "I could not find her. Moreover, the people of this place said, there has been no holy prostitute here." And Yehuda said, "Let her keep them for herself, lest we become a laughingstock. Here, I sent her this kid, but you could not find her." So, first, while modern interpreters and readers have issues with this passage, the characters do not. So we have to try and view it as they do, right? No one seems to be particularly upset in this case. There's not a temple prostitute or holy prostitute in the area, but no one is, even then, is sort of like, "Oh, we would never do that here." It's just sort of a, well, we don't do that. There's not one. But what we can say is Tamar realizes that Judah is not going to honor the requirement that Selah marry her, right? That was how the last part ended. He grew up, it had been a while. Tamar realizes Judah's not going to honor it, so she takes matters into her own hands, creating a way to ensure an heir for herself and for her first husband heir, right? Or seeing it open, she takes it. Freetham notes, with the death of Judah's wife, Tamar knows that he will be open to sexual diversion. She is veiled so that Judah does not recognize her, but thinks she's a prostitute. There's a lot of questions that we have here, right? She's veiled, but does that mean you're a prostitute if you wear a veil? There's so many, I don't know. We don't get an idea of the outfit, but there are lots and lots of questions, right? She clearly takes off her widow's robes. I'm assuming those might be black or some sort of mourning kind of attire, and then puts on whatever this outfit is, but it's not clear what that outfit might be. And so the question is, how does Judah never recognize her? Does she keep the veil on the whole time? What about her outfit makes her a prostitute? Is it revealing enough to entice, but not enough for him to recognize? There's all these questions that all these people, all these folks keep asking. It's not the point of the story, but if you're sort of getting into the practical nuts and bolts of this, there are lots of things that you go, this is weird on lots of levels. How would you not recognize her voice, recognize anything about all this kind of stuff? But again, that's not the point of the story, but it does have lots of questions within the story itself. So what she does do, though, she gets from Judah signs of his pledge, which are also signs of his identity, right? She doesn't just ask for well, give me your sandals or something. She asks for his ring, his staff, right? All these things that are clear identities of who Judah is and who he claims to be. And so she gets a very clear idea of that, right? And then Fritham notes, whatever her actions, she must not be identified as a prostitute. But Judah's failure to regain the signs of his identity signifies discontinuity, right? There's this weird, like, she knows exactly who she is and what she's doing. She takes off her robes, puts on these other robes to get what she needs, and puts back on her widow robes to keep this continuity of her choices, while Judah is clearly made choices that give away his identity, right? I mean, he literally hands them over to someone he doesn't even know, which is an interesting sort of turn of events. Again, Judah and his servants handle this discreetly, but they're not really sure what happened or where this woman went or what went on. They decide not to pursue it further because it's just going to get messier and messier if they do, right? Tamar has made a choice. Judah has made their choice. And when we have lots of questions, the text doesn't engage any of them, right? The text just says, this is 1, 2, 3. These are the movements. Here's what happened, right? There's no judgment on it. There's no commentary about it. It just is exactly what they claim. So thoughts on this? We'll look at the conclusion next, the whole rest of the chapter, but this is just sort of the actual movement parts that they've listed, which interestingly, Brueggemann has some comments on, but he doesn't have much other than what sort of the same thing Fritham says, which is Judah is clearly acting in her best interest, and Judah is just making a brief choice. All right, well, we'll jump in and keep going. So now it was after almost 3 new moons that Yehuda was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law has played the whore. In fact, she has become pregnant from whoring. Yehuda said, bring her out and let her be burned. But as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law saying, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, pray recognize whose seal and cords and staff are these. Yehuda recognized them and said, she is in the right more than I. For after all, I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and he did not know her again. Now it was at the time of her birthing that twins were in her body. And as it was, as she was giving birth, that one of them put out a hand. The midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it was, as he pulled back his hand, here his other brother came out. So she said, what a breach you have breached for yourself. So they called this name Peretz. Breach, rather. Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was the scarlet thread, and they called his name Zerah. So the resolution of our story, which is a beautifully written reversal. The neighbors all accuse her of playing the whore, which is, of course, a wordplay. Well, she did. She did play the whore. She pretended to be, but they meant it in a much more derogatory way than the way she handled it. They have it wrong, of course, exactly how that works. Tamar has denied what was her right, what was her due, and went about getting it for herself. When confronted with the facts, Judah realizes what has happened and declares Tamar right or righteous. She did what she was supposed to do. I was in the wrong, which is not the turn that anyone expects at all. I don't know if it was as scandalous when they read it in the 1st century or the 8th century BC as it is now, but it's certainly not what you're expecting as the result today.
So then are they married after that?
No,
It never indicates.
no, that's
that
where
they-
it says that he did not know her again. He didn't have sex with her again. That's no in the Bible is always that code language. So it was just this one event so she could have an heir, but no, they did not get married.
She had the twins and,
Yeah, the twins, it continued the family line.
okay.
Yeah. The sons become heirs, right? Now the fun part, what on earth does this chapter mean? Right? Brueggemann has quite a bit to say, which I think is challenging and interesting. He's got a quote that goes on for about it's 2 paragraphs, but I'm going to quote him and read that, and then we'll see what we think if we buy what Brueggemann's selling. If we think differently, it's an interesting read though on it. The narrative contains a radical critique of morality for those who would pursue it. The text makes a judgment about relative guilt. Tamar has committed the kind of sin, quote, good people, unquote, prefer to condemn, engaging in deception and illicit sex and bringing damage to a good family. For a moment, until aware of his own involvement, Judah reacts on the basis of that sort of morality. In ways apparently congruent with popular morality, Judah has spurned the claims of his daughter-in-law. By his indifference, he has violated her right to well-being and dignity in the community. That is, by refusing to let her get married to the last son and giving her a husband, he has basically kept her outside of the community and given her really nothing, because a woman couldn't own land, they couldn't own animals, they couldn't do anything other than just be this sort of extra and tragic figure. The narrative juxtaposes his prudent but self-serving withholding and her deceptive harlotry. In that context, a new insight about righteousness comes out of the mouth of Judah. He draws an unexpected conclusion. In the midst of this sordid story of sexuality, there is a new understanding of righteousness. The story may give us pause about the usual bourgeois dimensions of sin. What is taken most seriously is not a violation of sexual convention, but damage to the community, which includes a poor, diminished female. What do you think? What do we think of Brueggemann's thought here, that it's really as much about community and this woman's ability to survive and thrive that is more important than the sexuality itself?
Well, I don't know. Bill, did she in fact do anything wrong?
I don't think so. I mean, certainly Judah doesn't think so. He declares her right.
No.
So
No. I mean,
guess-
actually, it was supposed to happen, right?
yeah,
The only struggle I'm having is I'm still trying to understand and always have the purpose of this.
Yeah.
What's it try to tell me?
It kind of reminds me of John Porter's sermon from this past week, where, I mean, he's working with that
the divorce
Yes.
narrative.
well, yeah, I mean, that was part of it. And so I guess where he comes out is saying, with his culture references, the character who says, well, it's the difference between what's right and what's good. Sometimes they're not the same.
Right. Well, I guess Stefan, to a certain degree, you would say, what did she do wrong? Technically, she did have sex with her father-in-law, and under incorrect guise, right? Claimed to be a temple prostitute or gave that impression. They had sex outside of marriage, which is forbidden. I mean, there's all those kinds of things about sexuality that's within there that she did wrong on a smaller level, but the bigger problem was that she didn't have an heir. So she used what she could to get what she needed. But there are some goods in conflict if you're going to talk sort of an ethics content, that she did technically break some rules for a larger goal or a higher good.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it kind of from, the way Judah looks at it and saying, well, yeah, what she did was maybe technically wrong, but it was really all in all, it worked out.
It did.
And I mean, sort of my take on that, on the passage, was what counts is really what's in your heart. And I mean, I think it's at least, it looks like at the end here, Judah, it shows some compassion.
Oh, he definitely shows compassion. I mean, the last thing we had was Judah literally selling his brother off to Egypt, and not really a good image at all, right? And now here he comes out to be a pretty decent guy, which again, you sort of go, wow, these are complex relationships all the way around, aren't they?
Right. They're doing the players without a scorecard.
Hmm. And even then, do we know the players hardly?
But why is this whole liturgy and heredity important to our story? I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, do we ever hear anything more about the two sons?
Yes. Yeah, they show back up again. The sons
Do
cause
they?
trouble.
Okay. Okay, well, that's why it's in here then, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Where do they show up again, Bill?
It's a little bit later, but they talk about how Zara tries to mess up the community, or not Zara, the parrots rather. There's a whole
Okay.
conversation about things that they do and get in trouble with and cause problems with. So, but I don't remember exactly where. Further in the story.
Gotcha. So this story is to point out where they came from. All right. Okay.
Yeah. I guess that's at least part of it. You got to introduce them, I guess. And you have to give them the same sort of, this is the one thing that I've seen numerous scholars talk about. Whenever you have two twins born or you have an older and younger brother, you should know that the younger brother is always going to be the one that God favors, right? It's almost universal. So we got twins again. Oh, wonder what's going to happen next with these two guys, right? I mean, it happens over and over and over again. So you've got these two and they tie a cord around one's hand and one's trying to get out first, and all these kinds of things end up being very much similar kind of process, right?
Yeah, we have heard a similar story before, haven't we?
Yes.
Between Esau and Israel, or Jacob, I don't know.
Bill, what is the, I don't know, history you would say of women wearing veils? I mean, that crops up a lot.
I mean, I think some of it's probably not dissimilar from what we know of it now. That you have women sort of out of modesty wearing coverings and being covered, but it's not altogether clear if how much of that is a need in the desert and in those hot areas to be covered and to keep the grit and sand and everything else off your face. How much of it is that sort of modesty kind of model? How much of it is mark of status and connections and all that kind of, those are answers I don't have. But I think it does play into a lot of that kind of things that we would say we've long put away as modern folk, but obviously is at play in these conversations about women wearing very specific clothing to signify specific status and roles in the community.
Well, a few verses ago, when we were talking about the woman wearing the veil, and that she could have been a whore or something.
Yeah. Yep, she could have been a whore, but then maybe she wasn't a whore, but it's so like, and maybe there's a specific type of veil that you wear to signify that. I have no idea. I'm not sure if anybody does anymore. I mean, the hard thing is a lot of these are references that made sense when they wrote the story, but have long been lost or obscured by time. Other thoughts on this part? So, Freetham does add a lovely wrinkle that I really liked. noting the Hebrew, when Judah saw her as a prostitute, a zonah, he used her. But when he sees her in this capacity as his daughter-in-law, zanah, in other words, one letter different, he condemns her. Clearly, Judah applies a double standard. Here's the more fun part of it. In the Hebrew, zonah and zanah, that is the biblical Hebrew, there aren't vowels. So it's a prostitute and daughter-in-law look almost identical in the Hebrew because there's not a different letter. Right? You read it differently because of the context, but the spelling itself is exactly the same. So it's an interesting play, which there's always, I mean, this is the part that's so hard about the Old Testament that rabbis get to play with and teach all the time. There are tons of ways that there's wordplay going on, or puns, or a variety of things. Much like all of the neighbors saying, "Oh, she acted like a whore and is now pregnant," and it's like, well, actually, she did act like a whore. Funny you mentioned that. Not the way you meant. Kind of thing. I mean, we're supposed to laugh at that. We're supposed to go, "Oh, well, yeah, we know the story, but you didn't get the story exactly the way it meant," right? So, Stefan, you were asking the other question, the other clear connection of why do we have this story? That part's not clear, but we have to wrestle with it as Christians because the first chapter of Matthew gives Jesus's genealogy. Luke's gospel does the same, but Matthew includes 5 women in the story, specifically Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. Right? So we have an extra sort of, as Christians, we have an extra level of sort of going, well, what does it mean that Jesus's great-great-grandmama is Tamar, right? And this story is part of his story, in part because it's also the great-grandmother of David, right? This is some people argue that some of this historically was also to explain why, depending on how cynical, I guess, you want to get, some people will say that both the book of Ruth and this story of Tamar are political propaganda to explain away problems in David's lineage. Right? Why is a Moabite who you're not supposed to marry in the family tree for King David? Why is Tamar, who acted improperly, included as the grandmother, or what is it, great-great-grandmother of King David? Right? Depends on which way you want to read it. Interesting, 4 of those women use their sexuality to gain an heir in connection to the promise and covenant of God. That is, if we go back, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba are all known for explicitly using their sexuality to get married, to have a child, to get what they need, right? Mary does not. She stands alone against that. But all 4 use their sexuality in specific ways, and none of them are condemned for that, right? While there's lots of code and conduct that's listed for appropriate ways to be sexual beings, these 4 women used their sexuality to specifically advance their cause, the community, their life, and are applauded for it, not condemned for it, even given special status for it, which is fascinating, right? In each case, they get an heir and a connection to that promised covenant, when they might not have been. Tamar likely would have been locked out if she had not done something. Ruth is from Moab, so she literally is someone who's not supposed to marry an Israelite, yet ends up marrying into the family tree. And Tamar and Ruth specifically get caught up in the Levirate marriage contracts. We just read the roundabout. Tamar, Ruth, in her case, her husband dies. She goes back to Israel from Moab, back to Israel with her mother-in-law Naomi, and she finds a good husband who is a cousin, perhaps, of her husband, who claims her as part of the Levirate marriage requirements. Right? So it's, again, these things keep coming back, but we're not exactly sure if this is an exception to the rule or this is just to explain the regular rule of how things went in the ancient world with some of these marriage contracts. So, Christians, my friends, this text has a greater claim on our thinking with its connection to our Messiah. Matthew literally adds them. Luke does not include them. He only goes through the male, like father to father to son, all the way through the text. But Matthew is the one who makes sure to point out these connections explicitly, right? To connect them to the women of faith. And it's just an interesting kind of context. And people have argued about what that means, why Matthew chose to do it. Now, the one thing I do find fascinating is two things. Number one, in those genealogies, Judah is listed as the parents of as the father of the twins, not his son. So the Levirate marriage thing that like, oh, well, you have to hand them off to the brother to connect the family tree, all that kind of stuff is ignored in the genealogies. Instead, it's just straight from Judah. Judah's sons were by Tamar, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you recall, I started the whole conversation with a quote from Brueggemann, who basically says, oh, this text is tangential and unimportant and not really, it's sort of strange and weird, and it is. But because of its connection with Matthew, we have to deal with it differently as Christians. One question is, if Jesus knew this, how did it impact his ministry? Or how should we impact our view of God, women, and yes, sexuality? If that's included in the line, what does it say about our views of sexuality and understanding of how this might work, right? Most people tend to take it more. The interesting thing that I do find fascinating is a lot of folks, when they talk about it, talk about why these women were included, like Bathsheba and Ruth and Tamar, tend to talk about the second more than the first question I asked, right? Like, oh, it's proof that God approves of women making choices and being active parts of the faith, and those kinds of things are the interpretation, at least modern and recent interpretations tend to go in that way. Few actually talk about how does it impact Jesus. If you grew up and your great-great-grandmother was Tamar, what do you do with that, right? Those are big questions I'm asking you. What do y'all think? You don't get to stay silent for this one.
Well, I'm thinking about, who Matthew was and who he was writing to. And, we see, we clearly Matthew has a lot to say, and encounters with the Pharisees in which they are not portrayed in a favorable light. And even I think as he gets sort of toward the end of his gospel, it's sort of, instances in which earlier he may have said Pharisees, or he may have said scribes, or, whatever, maybe he will even say Jews.
Right.
And so, there's this thought that, Matthew's community was experiencing some discord with some of the Jewish leaders. And so I just, wonder how much it's so, it's like, in your face kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, how much is it a critique of just saying, oh yeah, your lineage is so pure and everything, right?
Right.
Well, all this hanky panky going on in this book. Oh,
In the Bible.
How do the Jews interpret this?
I think the same way we're talking about it. I don't think there's a different interpretation on the sexuality side of it.
Okay.
Bill, I've always struggled with these genealogies. How do you trace the genealogy of Jesus's father?
Well, yeah, then there's that.
Oh.
I struggle with it. I just really struggle with it, Bill. Okay,
Agreed.
yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, there's a logical breakdown on the last generation, right?
They didn't-
Yes, yeah, there is.
Well, you had one with Judah too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
They didn't count Joseph in the hierarchy of things because Jesus wasn't his son technically. I mean, from what.
Well, no, and the
Well, not
genealogy,
biologically.
the genealogy for Matthew and for Luke both say all of the tracing of the lineage is through Joseph.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Really?
It's all through
Exactly.
Joseph, and that's
And yet Joseph is not Jesus's father. So I've always
Right.
struggled with
Understand
it.
that. Looks like it would all be through, looks like it would all be through Mary. Instead of.
At
through
least according to our theology, he's not. But okay, there
Yeah.
you go.
well, I mean, and not just our theology, our the text, right? It's fascinating to me always that Luke very clearly, and Matthew for that matter, both very clearly say he is conceived by the Holy Spirit, right? There's a whole conversation about it, it's much more in Luke than Matthew, but either way, there's a pretty clear idea that it's not Joseph's son. And then they go through this whole genealogy, and you're like, why did you do that? Like,
Exactly. It's
Oh,
always
yeah, I mean,
his stepdad's really a good guy.
yeah, right, exactly.
I mean, Matthew has the part, where, Joseph was thinking about, dismissing her quietly
Right, right.
and until, he gets the angel in the dream.
Yeah.
Bill, I'm not sure that the story would impact Jesus's ministry very much. I think it would be, if he knew all about it, then I think he would look at it just part of being human. And I think he had bigger fish to fry, if you will. He had more things to do.
Yeah.
He had more things to do, bigger things to think about, bigger lessons to teach.
Good point, Roy.
Very good.
Yeah,
one.
I think on one level, yes. And I think, but I guess I probably should have said, how does it inform his ministry? Like, I mean, I do think it sounds completely up Jesus's alley, right? I mean, when you talk about the stoning of the woman and he's like, okay, well, the first person without sin, stone her. And it's like, oh, never mind. I mean, I think that some of those tales and stories we know about Jesus fit into the story of tomorrow, sort of understanding, like you said, that it 100% is Jesus understanding human nature and recognizing where righteousness really is versus just sort of a simple reading and going, well, yeah, she shouldn't have done that. We should stone her or whatever, realizing that there's more complexity to it.
Yeah, I remember when we were studying, I guess it was the Gospel of Mark, and you talked to us about the encounters at the well.
Yeah.
So and then I guess and then we had not only that, but we had the sheep shearing going on here, just like with Boaz, right? And,
Yeah.
or I guess, or maybe that was the grain. I can't remember, but anyway.
As a threshing floor with Boaz and Ruth.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. It's all agricultural.
That's
But
the only place you had to meet people. Yeah.
Yeah, the well was the place to do it.
Yes.
to do what, Lynn?
That was the place to meet people.
Oh, okay.
The women better be looking good when they went to the well, hadn't they?
Deep thoughts
Yeah.
in the well.
Wonder if that's where the teenagers hung out.
Yeah, probably.
I think the answer is that absolutely, Roy.
Right.
I said, deep thoughts in the well.
I also have a question, okay? What else did a woman have to use besides her sexuality?
Good question. Yeah.
Several
her wits and her
thousand years
sexuality. Yeah.
Several thousand years ago. What else did they have?
Yeah. She had
Nothing.
no other ability to do anything.
There's
so of course.
nothing. That's it. Okay.
Make good bread.
Yeah, but she only had, her only power was through a husband or a son.
Right.
Exactly.
I think good cooking was prized.
Yeah.
I mean, what they said,
Yeah, right.
I mean, didn't one rabbi offer that it was okay to divorce a woman just because she fixed a bad meal?
Oh, no,
Yes, I think that's true, actually.
dear. Uh-oh.
Yeah,
Oh, I might be in trouble. Seldon's a better cook than I am. Oh, my.
yeah. No, it's an interesting story. It's one that, I mean, on one level, I agree completely with Brueggemann that it's one that like, why is it here? What is it doing? Sort of to Stefan's point, like, I don't get it. I think is an appropriate response. But on another level, I actually particularly love stories like this that don't give you a simple answer.
Hmm.
That force us to evaluate a little bit more, and especially the reversal of this one, right? I mean, the reversal is so delicious in this one where you think she's in trouble and she's gonna get stoned. I mean, it's sort of the Scarlet Letter, except for she outs Dimsdale instead of taking
She
the
was
shot.
very clever to take what she took from him.
Yeah, yeah. She looked down the road and knew exactly what she needed to get out of jail free card.
Right.
Salvation.
She knew, she was smart.
Well, good stuff, my friends. Well, we'll just be on next week. Go back to the story of Joseph and to the stuff we've already heard a million times. This one, like we said, does not get brought up for children's storybooks or the lectionary. So
Yeah, all the stuff that's going on while Joseph's down in Egypt. Yeah.
yeah, this is meanwhile back in Cana.
So that's how we should start this chapter, huh?
Probably.
Okay, got it.
It'll be another good discussion.
That's what was missing.
Yeah. I love it. All right, my friends. Well, we will see you soon.
Thank you,
Okay.
Bill.
It's
Thanks,
everybody.
Bill. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, Bill.
We're sending y'all some rain.
Yeah, we're sending you a lot of rain.
Thanks.
Yeah, I saw a blurb about severe storms up your way, so.
We
Yeah.
just had one while we were sitting here listening
Thundering
to this,
and-
thunder, lightning, wonder where the
Yeah.
ark was.
Might be coming your way.
It is.
Bye.
We'll
y'all.
get it